Hi there, it's so lovely having you back here once again. Let us continue doing some exercises looking at functions and relationships, and specifically relationships between the variables x and y. And remember, x and y could be any real life variables or quantities such as temperature and weather, or the number of articles and products that people buy, and so on. So the variables actually represent real life quantities and things. So let's look at the first exercise that we will be doing. Here we are given a table. We've got values for x at the top, and then we see we've got one variable that we must also calculate, and then also we are given in the same table we've got y, and then also we've got an unknown variable a that we will obviously have to calculate. Let's see what's the first question. The question basically says, find the general rule that describes the relationship between x and y. And remember, we talk about a general rule, or we can talk about a formula, or we can talk about the relationship. These are all rules, or these are all words that actually are used to describe, or that, yeah, to basically describe the relationship between two variables, in this case x and y. Remember also, the rule actually is the pattern that is used to create the output values, which is basically the sequence of the numbers here at the bottom, and y basically is the output, and then these numbers are basically created by means of this general rule. So we are asked to calculate or to find this rule. And remember what we normally do. It's easier to start off by seeing or checking whether there's a constant difference in the sequence of numbers that we have in here in the output. Because once we have a constant difference, we know that we can then develop or find the rule quite easily. Now let's start off. We know how to calculate the constant difference. We just take the first two terms, or term 2 minus term 1, and that's minus 8 minus 5. In other words, from we've got 8 minuses, we take 5 minuses away, we are left with 3 minuses, or rather minus 3. And that gives us a difference between the first two terms. And if we continue and we just look at term 3 and term 2, just to confirm that actually the difference between all the consecutive terms, that it is actually a constant difference. So that's why we check term 3 minus term 2, and we see that it's minus 11 minus 8. That also gives us minus 3. And now we can conclude that yes, we actually do have a constant difference, which is minus 3. So now we can use that constant difference to create the rule. And we know that the way where we start off finding the rule is basically we start off by saying y is equal to the constant difference times the input x, and then plus or minus another value that we must find to fill in to this empty box. And then we take the constant difference and we just write it in a mathematical language, and then this gives us y is equal to minus 3x plus obviously this empty box that we must still fill in. And we know in order to fill in the empty box, we must do two tests with the constant difference that we've calculated. And the reason or the purpose of the tests is actually to find the value in that box. Let's see how we do that. We take the first two values, the value for x and the value for y, and then we fill it into our equation that's at the moment half completed. And then we see y is minus 5, and then x is 0, so we fill it in. And we see, and remember also part of the test is to try and balance the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the equation. And because the number that we balance it with will be the number that will eventually be filled into the box. But we must do the test twice in order to make sure that the number is actually correct. So we see on the left hand side we've got minus 5, and if we calculate what we have on the right hand side, we see it's minus 3 times 0, that is 0. So what do we need to make the right hand side also equal to the left hand side? We must minus 5, because then it will be 0 minus 5, that also gives us minus 5. So at this stage it looks like minus 5 could be the number that must come into the empty box in order to complete the equation, but we must do another test just to make sure that minus 5 is indeed the number. Let's do the next test. There's 2. We take the next two sets or next set of numbers or pair of numbers, which is 1 for x and minus 8 for y, and then we put it in our equation again. So minus 8 will be equal to minus 3 times 1, which is x. And again, we must balance the left-hand side and the right-hand side. We see the left-hand side is minus 8, and the right-hand side, if we multiply this out, it's minus 3 times 1. That gives us minus 3. We see that in order to get the right-hand side also equal to minus 8, we must minus 5. In other words, we'll have minus 3 minus 5, and that will give us minus 8. Now we see that indeed the number minus 5 will actually be the number that we must add into the empty box. And now we can complete our equation. And so our rule, general rule, and sometimes remember when we talked about a general rule, when we did our patterns, numeric patterns and geometric patterns, we also called it the nth term. So here we have got it. Y is then equal to minus 3x minus 5. So here we've got our rule. You follow? Now we can continue and calculate A and B, as we will see will be our next questions. Let's see. Let's calculate A. We see that A is actually in the position of Y. And then together with A goes 15, which is in the position of X. So we can use those two values and then just simplify. So we've got our rule, general rule that we determined. And now we can fill in A in the place of Y and 15 in the place of X. And we simplify and we see that A is actually equals to minus 50. You got that? And so we can continue and calculate B. And what is unique about B? B is actually in the place of X, and then minus 83 is in the place of Y. So we can substitute that in our rule and we simplify. So we can calculate B. Minus 83 goes in the place of 83. Or sorry, minus 83 goes in the place of Y rather. And then B goes in the place of X. And now we see, what does this look like? It actually looks like an algebraic equation. So we just follow our rules or the skills that we've learned with the algebraic equations, and then we just move the part that has the unknown B, we just put it on the left hand side so that it's easier to make B then the subject of the equation so that we can solve it. So we start off by getting rid of the minus 5, and we know we do the additive inverse, which is plus 5, so that they can cancel out, and we do the same on the right hand side. We see that cancel, the minus 5 and plus 5 cancel out, and then we're left with minus 3b on the left hand side, and then on the right hand side, if we simplify minus 83 plus 5, that gives us minus 78. And now we can then we know now we must get rid of the minus 3, and we see we're multiplying minus 3 with a b, so we must use the multiplicative inverse, which is divide by minus b. to divide by minus 3 rather, in order to get rid of the minus 3. And then we do the same on the right hand side. So the minus 3 that we multiply with and the minus 3 that we divide with, we just cancel that out. And then we simplify the minus 78 divided by minus 3. That gives us B is equal to 26. You've got that. All right, let us continue. And here we've got a more interesting one, because now we've got mixed numbers and we've got fractions, and we'll see. But the way we solve our problem, in this case, the empty boxes in the table, we solve it in exactly the same way that we've done before. We've worked with fractions before, so we just continue working like that. So what we're seeing here, we are asked to, if we are given this table, we are asked to complete the table. And what do we see now in order to complete the table? We see that the output actually is a sequence of numbers. Now, the question is, how was the sequence of numbers generated? We see that first of all, we had 1.5, then we've got a half, then we've got minus half, and then minus 1.5. We see if we, every time there's a difference of 1 or minus 1 rather. So we're subtracting 1 every time as we develop the next number. So for us now to get to the next number after minus 1.5, in other words, we're just subtracting 1, or we can say we're adding minus 1. That will then become minus 2.5. And obviously, if you minus another 1 there, we know then the next number will be minus 3.5. You with me there? So that is how we can then complete the table. Now, the next step says, determine the rule or the formula that describes the relationship between x and y. And we know we always start off by first checking whether there is a constant difference, because we know now how to use the constant difference actually to develop the rule. So we've just seen now, we can do it now formally. T2 minus T1, in order to calculate the difference between T2 and T1, we see that is a half minus 1.5. Now, we see that will give us minus 1. So let's see if we take T2 minus, or rather T3 minus T2, we see that is minus a half minus another half. So basically that gives us also minus 1. It's almost like you have two halves that you're adding together, but they are negative halves, and they give us a negative 1. You got that? And that shows us that now we've got a constant difference, which we now can use to actually develop the rule. And let's go now and see how we will then develop the rule. So we take our rule, we know it's y is equal to the constant difference times the input plus our empty box. So let's remember our constant difference is minus 1. So we put it in to write this as a mathematical equation, or in a mathematical language. We know that minus 1, if you multiply with something else, you don't have to write the 1. So it's just minus and then x plus or minus our empty box. Now let's do our two tests. First of all, we take 0 and 1.5. So y is 1.5, and x is 0. So it's minus 1 times 0, minus 1 times 0, and that gives us 0. And we know that in order for us now to balance the left and right hand side, we must also add 1.5 on the right hand side, so that the left and the right hand side are equal. And now we must do the second test just to make sure that 1.5 is actually the number that must go into the empty box. So we take the next set or pair of numbers, the 1 and the half. So y is a half, and then x is 1. So we've got minus 1 on the right hand side. So in order to get the right hand side also the same as the left hand side, we see actually we must add a 1.5. So and how will that work? This is -1 and that's -1.5, so the 1 will be subtracted and we're left with a half, which will be equal to the left hand side. So now we see 1.5 is actually the number that we must put into our empty box. So now we can complete our equation, which will then be y is equal to minus x plus 1.5. So that is now our rule or our formula that we now had to determine, which is actually the formula that created the numbers in the output part of the table. That's it. I hope that you have lots of fun with the exercises.